A quiet morning and a lonely man. The small alley welcomed the new day with an unusual stillness. The early morning sunlight filtered through the branches of old trees, casting long shadows over the worn-out steps. The steady footsteps of Andrew echoed through the empty space. Andrew was familiar with his job, a postman, walking through the same familiar streets every day, delivering letters that carried hope, longing, and sometimes things that were never meant to be said. But there was one sight he always encountered on his route. On a wooden bench in front of a small apartment sat an old man in silence. Thomas, a name well known in the neighborhood, yet few truly knew much about him. His eyes were always gazing into the distance, as if waiting for something that would never come. That morning, as Andrew passed by, Thomas unexpectedly spoke up. "Young man, may I ask you for a favor?" Andrew stopped in his tracks and turned back. This was the first time the old man had ever initiated a conversation with him. "Yes, sir. What do you need?" Thomas slowly reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old envelope. The edges were worn, as if it had been kept for a very long time. "Can you send this letter for me?" Andrew took the letter but immediately noticed something strange. There was no recipient address. He looked up, slightly puzzled. "Sir, you haven't written an address yet?" Thomas looked at him for a moment, then smiled faintly, a tired, weary smile. "This letter is for someone who may never read it." Those words made Andrew freeze. He could feel the deep sorrow hidden within the old man's hoarse voice. He didn't know what was written in the letter, but he understood that it was more important than any letter he had ever delivered. He nodded, carefully placing the letter in his bag. Then he continued on his way, yet he couldn't shake the thought of it from his mind. The letter without a recipient. That night, back in his room, Andrew placed the letter on his desk, staring at it. The paper had yellowed with age. The handwriting on the envelope was neat but slightly shaky. It seemed to have existed for a long time, but had never been sent. Why had he kept it for so many years without mailing it? The next morning, before starting work, Andrew stopped by a small cafe. This was where the elderly in the neighborhood often gathered to chat. If anyone knew about Thomas, they would be the ones he needed to ask. Andrew approached an old man stirring his tea. "Sir, do you know anything about Mr. Thomas?" The man looked up, squinting at Andrew for a moment before slowly nodding. "He's been living alone for a long time. No visitors, no wife, no family." Another person chimed in. "But I heard he once had a daughter." Andrew's heart skipped a beat. A daughter? He tightened his grip around the letter in his bag. Could it be that this letter was meant for her? Suddenly, the letter in his hands felt heavier than ever. The beginning of the search. Andrew clutched the letter tightly as he returned to the post office, his mind restless. His daily job was to deliver letters, but this time, the letter had no recipient. A letter without an address, without a postal mark, a forgotten message, or one that never had the chance to reach the person it was meant for. Ordinarily, Andrew would have set it aside, letting time bury the words inside it. But something about Thomas's gaze wouldn't let him. This wasn't just a letter, it was an untold story. That afternoon, Andrew decided to return to the small street where Thomas lived. He started asking around the neighbors, hoping to find some clues. A middle-aged man shook his head. "I only know that he has lived there for as long as I can remember. No one ever visits him." A woman, the owner of a small grocery store at the end of the street, thought for a moment before saying, "I remember that. When he was younger, he had a family, but no one has seen them in years." Andrew nodded, feeling more certain that the letter was connected to Thomas's past. Finally, when he asked an elderly woman who lived next door to Thomas, he found a crucial lead. She gazed at Andrew with a thoughtful expression, as if deciding whether or not to tell him. "You know, Thomas wasn't always alone like he is now. When he was younger, he had a daughter." Andrew held his breath. "A daughter?" The old woman nodded. "But they lost contact a long time ago. I don't know the details, but since the day she left, he never spoke of her again." Andrew felt his heart pounding. This letter was undoubtedly meant for his daughter. Something had separated them, leaving the old man to sit there, growing older each day, carrying an unsaid longing that no one could understand. And Andrew knew He couldn't let the story end in silence. The words in the letter. That afternoon, when Andrew returned to find Thomas, the old man was still sitting on the same worn-out bench in front of his small apartment. But this time, Andrew had no intention of just walking past him. He stepped closer, stopping right in front of the elderly man, and gently asked, "Would you like me to help find the person this letter is meant for?" Thomas looked up, his eyes flickering with emotion. There was no immediate response. The old man remained silent for a long time, his trembling hands resting on his knees, barely noticeable. Then unexpectedly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the envelope. Unlike before this time, he opened it and silently handed the letter inside to Andrew. "Read it." Andrew hesitated for a moment, then carefully unfolded the letter. The ink had slightly faded over time, but every word carried a profound weight of emotion. "My dearest daughter, I have searched for you all these years. The day you left, I couldn't hold you back. That was my mistake. If you ever read these words, please know that I have never stopped loving you." Just a short passage, yet Andrew felt as if an entire lifetime of regret and longing was being laid out before him. A father who, for years, had only one wish, to let his daughter know that he had never forgotten her. Andrew's throat tightened as he looked up at Thomas. "How long have you kept this letter?" Thomas let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no joy in it. "A long time, long enough that I can't even remember anymore." Andrew clenched the letter in his hands. This old man had lived his entire life in regret, but perhaps it wasn't too late to set things right. He took a deep breath, then looked straight into Thomas's eyes. "I will help you find her." This time, Thomas didn't shake his head. He didn't say a word, but in his weary old eyes there was a faint glimmer of hope, and Andrew knew he had just taken on a mission far from easy. Because sometimes finding someone lost in the past was harder than finding an address that no longer existed. But no matter what, he would not give up, because of a letter that was never sent, and because of a father who never stopped loving his daughter. A clue from an old photograph. The golden hues of the evening sunlight streamed through the small apartment window, casting a warm glow on the worn-out furniture. Andrew sat across from Thomas, still weighed down by the words in the letter. "I will help you find her." His voice broke the silence of the dimly lit room. But Thomas did not respond immediately. He simply reached into an old wooden drawer, pulled something out, and placed it in front of Andrew. A photograph, yellowed by time. Andrew carefully picked it up and examined it. The image showed a young girl, around 10 years old, her wide eyes filled with innocence and curiosity. Beside her stood a woman with a gentle smile, her hand resting tenderly on the child's shoulder. On the back of the photograph, a faint inscription read, "Evelyn." Andrew repeated the name in his mind. "Evelyn. Is this your daughter?" Thomas nodded slowly. His eyes drifted into the distance, as if he were gazing into a world only he could see. "When I took this picture, I never imagined it would be the last time I saw her." His voice was low, tinged with undeniable sorrow. Andrew could feel the fear behind Thomas's expression. Not the fear of failing to find Evelyn, but the fear of being rejected by his own daughter. The old man's frail hands clenched slightly, as if he were wrestling with his own emotions. "If I find her, do you want to meet her?" Thomas fell into a long silence. Then finally he let out a sigh. "I don't know." Andrew understood. This man had lived in the shadows of the past for too long. Even when given a chance to step back into the light, he wasn't sure if he had the courage to face it. But Andrew was different. He knew he had to find Evelyn, because of a letter that was never sent, and because of a father who never stopped loving his daughter. The search begins. Finding someone with only a name and an old photograph was not an easy task. Andrew spent days chasing every possible lead, hoping to uncover a trace of Evelyn's whereabouts. He started in the old neighborhoods, speaking to elderly residents who might remember Thomas and his family, but most responses were shakes of the head or vague recollections. Then, in a small library on the outskirts of town, he found something that made his heart race. A name, Evelyn Carter, a teacher, living in a town nearly 100 kilometers away. Andrew's pulse quickened as he read the details. This had to be her. Without hesitation, he set off immediately. After hours of driving, he finally reached the small town where Evelyn lived. It was a peaceful place, with clean, cobblestone streets and rows of small, charming houses nestled close together. Andrew made his way to the elementary school where she worked. As he stepped through the gate, he could hear the laughter of children playing in the courtyard, their voices echoing through the crisp air. He approached a teacher and asked about Evelyn. The woman looked at him with slight curiosity. "Evelyn? She's very kind and devoted to her students, but I've never heard her mention her family." Andrew felt a tightness in his chest. It seemed that Evelyn had completely severed all ties with her past. He took a deep breath and gathered his courage before asking, "May I speak with her?" The teacher hesitated for a moment, then pointed toward a classroom at the end of the hallway. "She's in class right now, but if you wait, she'll be out in a few minutes." Andrew nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation. And then, the classroom door opened and Evelyn stepped out. She was no longer the little girl from the photograph. She was now a grown woman, her long hair neatly tied back, her eyes sharp yet distant, carrying a sense of guarded strength. When she noticed a stranger waiting for her, she frowned slightly. "Who are you?" Andrew clenched the letter in his pocket, then slowly spoke. "I've come to give you a letter from your father." Immediately, Evelyn's expression turned cold. There was no shock, no hesitation, only an impenetrable wall instantly erected between them. "I don't want anything from him." Her voice was sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. Andrew wasn't surprised. He had prepared for this reaction. "You don't have to accept it, but you can read it. Just once." Evelyn crossed her arms, her eyes darkening. "You don't understand. He abandoned my mother and me when I was a child. When my mother died, I made a promise to myself. I would never forgive him." Andrew looked at her, feeling a weight settle in his heart. For years, Thomas had believed he lost his daughter due to a mistake in the past. But in reality, Evelyn believed that her father had abandoned her. They had been living in two completely different stories all these years. Andrew clenched his fists. Some wounds couldn't be healed by a single letter, but he couldn't let the story end here, because there was a truth Evelyn didn't know, and she needed to hear it. A buried past. Evelyn stood still, her gaze wary as she studied Andrew. "I don't want anything to do with him anymore." Her voice was cold and firm, as if she had buried every memory of her father long ago. Andrew didn't rush to hand over the letter. He knew that if he forced the issue, she would walk away without ever giving him another chance. Taking a deep breath, he spoke calmly. "I'm not here to make you meet him. I just want you to know that he never forgot you." Evelyn's brow furrowed slightly, but she kept her guard up. "It doesn't matter what he says. When I was 12, my mother died. He wasn't there. I waited, I hoped, but he never came back." Her voice wavered, even though she tried to hide it. Andrew realized that this wasn't just anger, it was pain. The pain of a child who felt abandoned, who grew up with unanswered questions. He exhaled softly, then slowly pulled out the letter from his coat pocket and placed it on the table between them. "I can't change the past, and I know you can't either, but I think there are things you need to know. If you read this letter and still feel the same way, I won't bother you again." Evelyn looked at the letter but didn't reach for it. The silence stretched between them. Finally, she sighed, picked it up, but didn't open it right away. "I'll read it, but that doesn't mean I'll forgive him." Andrew nodded. He knew this was the first step. A distorted truth. Andrew didn't stay to watch Evelyn read the letter. He knew she needed time. That evening, he returned to Thomas's small apartment. When he stepped inside, the old man was still sitting by the window, his vacant eyes staring into the distance, as if he had spent a lifetime waiting for something that would never come. "Did she read it?" His voice trembled, filled with hope, but also fear of the answer. Andrew pulled up a chair and sat down, studying the frail man before replying. "She took it, but she still believes you abandoned her." Thomas flinched, his eyes brimming with unspoken grief. "She thinks that?" His voice cracked, as if a piece of him had just shattered. "I never abandoned her." His thin, aged hands clenched tightly around the armrest of his chair. "When her mother fell ill, I did everything I could. I worked day and night. I ran everywhere to find money for treatment. But no matter how hard I tried, I still lost her. His voice choked. I didn't know how to be a father. I didn't know how to face her pain, or even my own pain. I did what I thought was best. I buried myself in work, believing that if I could earn enough money, I could give her a better life. A single tear rolled down his wrinkled face. But I was wrong. I didn't realize that what she needed most wasn't money, but a father. Andrew listened in silence. For the first time, he saw it clearly. Thomas wasn't a bad father. He was just a man who had made a mistake he had carried with him his entire life. Andrew spoke softly but with certainty. She needs to know the truth. Thomas shook his head. She chose to live without me. I don't blame her. I can't blame her. But Andrew wasn't going to let him run away anymore. It's not that you can't. You're just afraid. His words made Thomas freeze. You've spent your whole life fearing that Evelyn would reject you. But if you do nothing, you'll never know whether she actually hates you or not. Thomas closed his eyes, his frail hands trembling. Do you think she could forgive me? Andrew didn't make promises. It wasn't his choice to make. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on Thomas's shoulder, squeezing it lightly. There's only one way to find out. A flicker of hope sparked within him, and he knew the battle wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. The second letter and one last chance. The evening sun was setting when Andrew once again stood before Evelyn's door. This time he carried something important, the second letter from her father. The door opened and Evelyn saw Andrew standing there. But this time, her eyes no longer held the coldness they once did. She had read the first letter, and it had shaken the walls she had built over the years. Andrew extended the new envelope toward her, his voice calm but filled with urgency. This is the last letter he wrote for you. Evelyn slowly took it. She looked at Andrew for a long moment before stepping inside. Silence filled the room as she opened the letter. The words unfolded before her eyes, the ink slightly shaky, but every word carried a love she had never believed existed. Evelyn, I know that the wounds of the past may have made it impossible for you to forgive me, but I want you to know one thing. I have never stopped loving you. I'm sorry for not being there when you needed me the most. I'm sorry for letting you grow up in resentment. But my dear, if there is one thing I could change, it would be to hold you tightly on the day your mother left us. I don't dare ask for your forgiveness, but I hope that, even if it's too late, you know that I have always been here, waiting for you to come back. If you can, please, let me see you one last time. A tear fell onto the page. Evelyn covered her mouth, trying to suppress her emotions, but she couldn't. She had convinced herself that she no longer needed her father's love, but in reality, it had never left her. She turned to Andrew, her voice trembling. My father? Is he okay? Andrew nodded, hope shining in his eyes. He's still waiting for you. For the first time in years, Evelyn didn't hesitate. She had to go back, before it was too late. A reunion that never came. Evelyn didn't waste any more time. She packed a few things and left with Andrew. The entire journey back to the old town, her mind was flooded with memories. The afternoon she waited for her father to come home but never saw him. The long nights she cried herself to sleep in loneliness. The resentment she had carried all these years. But now she realized, perhaps her father had suffered in ways she had never understood. The car came to a stop in front of the small apartment. Evelyn stepped out, her heart pounding, filled with anticipation and nervousness. She had prepared herself to face him, but she hadn't prepared for what awaited her. Andrew knocked gently on the door, and at that moment, time seemed to stand still. Thomas was still sitting there, in his usual wooden chair by the window. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, as if he had simply fallen into a deep sleep. But he would not wake up again. The room suddenly felt suffocatingly empty. Evelyn froze. No, this can't be. She rushed to her father's side, her trembling hands reaching out to touch his frail arm. Cold. For the first time in years, tears streamed down her face uncontrollably. Dad, I'm home. But there was no reply. No one to hold her. No one to tell her that everything was okay. She had finally come back, but it was too late. Andrew lowered his head, his eyes burning with emotion as he watched the heartbreak in Evelyn's face. On the table beside the chair, a small piece of paper lay neatly placed. With trembling hands, Evelyn picked it up. Her father's final words appeared, faint yet full of love. "Evelyn, I have waited for you for so long. If you are reading these words, I may no longer be here to see you, but my dear, do not grieve. Just know that no matter where I am, I have always loved you. And I know that you have loved me too, even if you never said it aloud. Live a happy life, my child." The letter slipped from Evelyn's hands. She fell to her knees beside her father, sobs choking in her throat. All the words she had wanted to say, all the years she had waited for this moment, there was no one left to hear them anymore. Thomas's dream of seeing his daughter again had not come true, but perhaps he had left this world with the belief that, despite everything, his daughter had finally forgiven him. Life doesn't always give us a second chance. We think we have plenty of time. We put off important words, the things we need to say, the people we need to see, until it's too late. Evelyn had returned, but her father was no longer there to welcome her. Yet what truly mattered was that she had forgiven him, and she finally understood that love had never left her. If there is one thing this story teaches us, it is this. Learn to forgive the past and the ones you love, because life is never perfect. The truth can be misunderstood, the past can carry wounds, but love is the only thing that truly remains. Don't wait until it's too late to say what truly matters, because one day when you finally want to speak, that person may no longer be there to listen. Love while you still can, forgive while you still have the chance, and cherish the ones you love before they become nothing more than a distant memory.